would not.
That's right.
Daylight's off. Steady here.
I can't understand you.
How do you run on the rain?
He's reciting a poem. Keep tuned for the second half of this show. Thanks very much. Bye.
Community 13 would like to hear your response to the previous program. Call the Community 13 response line at 672-1313 to have your comment recorded. That's 672-1313 for the Community 13 response line.
Canadian wetlands. Nature at its finest. Hundreds of plant and animal species live in every native marsh. Another marsh. It's sterile. Native plants and wildlife have been choked out by this pretty flower called purple loosestrife or lithrum. This invading plant is devastating thousands of wetlands. Purple loosestrife is a European plant accidentally introduced into North America. It has no natural enemy on this continent. Its invasion continues unchecked. The spread from innocent domestic flower gardens into natural wetlands has happened at an alarming rate. Until control measures are approved, all we can do is pull and burn existing purple loosestrife and prevent further plantings anywhere, including home properties. Contact Ducks Unlimited, the Canadian Wildlife Service, or the Canadian Wildlife Federation. Purple loosestrife is killing wildlife habitat.
Provided as a service to the 125,000 cable television subscribers of Rogers Cable Systems and McLean Hunter Cable TV, this is Community 13, London.
Hello again, and welcome to Search Research, where we discuss science, technology, and intellectual inquiry in the London area. I'm your host, Peter Jedicke from the Fanshawe College School of Technology, and I'm introducing my guest today, Kent Peacock from the University of Western Ontario's Department of Philosophy. Welcome to the program, Kent.
Hi, good to meet you.
Now, we're here today to discuss the environment and ethics and things like this that go on that are hot topics, really, in a lot of ways. But what interests me really about it, and approach that you take to it, is that philosophy seems to be such an integrated kind of a way of looking at things. There's so many different fields and things that are drawn together. Have you felt the same thing in your studies?
Yes, definitely. My personal approach, and I think many of my colleagues, is you tend to look for connections. I actually got interested in it. Well, a little, maybe I could just sort of circle a field and just describe how I got into this.
Sure.
I actually did my PhD work in foundations of quantum mechanics and crazy things like that, which sort of, it tends to unsettle your mind in the first place.
Yeah, right.
But then I was also very interested in environmental ethics, environmental philosophy. I was given the chance to teach a couple of courses in that area, and it got me thinking quite a bit about the whole issue. And this led to, well, one of the major approaches to environmental ethics is through the works of a man named Aldo Leopold. It was actually a forestry professor who passed away about 45 or 50 years ago. But
so this is not something recent?
Well, his work was published some while ago, but it's sort of been in there as the background of most modern environmental ethics in some sense makes reference to him, either to disagree with him, because many people disagree with him, or
Right.
to agree with him, but he's sort of, you can't ignore him. He's in there as the sort of a major background figure in modern environmental ethics. So if you teach a course on it, you end up doing his stuff, inevitably. Now, the thing that interested me was his notion of an ethic. Where does it come from? And he argued that environmental ethics, the sort of idea of respect for the land, or what he called the land, we would now call the environment. He used the word land instead of environment, but that doesn't really matter. What he called the respect for the environment would come out of a need for what he called a symbiosis between human beings and the general non-human or worldly environment.
Well, when we say the word ethic, I think we tend to toss that out as if it's just a normal English word, but
Yeah.
what sort of technical feeling are we getting from what did Aldo Leopold mean when he talked about an ethic in the first place?
Well, it's useful to go back and look at the origins of the term. It's actually a Greek term. Many philosophical terms come from the Greek. And it's actually a pun, because the Greeks loved puns. Okay? And it's actually a combination of a word meaning habit and a word meaning virtue of character. So to be ethical is to have the habit of having a virtuous character.
So being a good person.
Yeah, but the trouble, too, is what is this concept of virtue, which again is a uniquely Greek concept, which we
Yes.
tend to lose sight of, but it has a lot of application in the environmental context. The word virtue is a mistranslation of an old Greek word, which means characteristic excellence relevant to an end. So it's what we call a teleological concept, which has a very biological flavor, okay? Because everything in nature tends to serve a function.
Right, it's goal-oriented somehow.
Well, you have to be very careful, because my heart, let us say, there, I just did it, does not have the goal of pumping blood. It doesn't know that it's supposed to pump blood, but nevertheless it serves that function, you
Right.
see.
Okay,
And
I
so
see what you're saying. It's not necessarily a conscious sort of, a goal that you think towards, but just something that happens in the natural course of things doing their function.
That's right, and it's very easy to slip into sort of language talking about conscious purpose, but you have to be careful not to get into that. But nevertheless, clearly nature tends to be purposeful in some sense. That's kind of built into nature.
Things get done.
Yeah, and they cohere in a very interesting way. So this idea, this interest they're linking ethics and symbiosis goes back to this. What Leopold said was, if we want to live in this earth for any period of time and not just fizzle out or go down, to sort of destroy our environment and then be destroyed ourselves in the process, and take a mutually beneficial relationship between us or them, or whatever you want to call the environment.
Was he thinking of basically the world as a two-element kind of system with mankind and them? Yeah, us and them, sort of, with mankind and all the rest of the environment.
Well, the point is, he was trying to get away from that. And you see, we have a natural tendency to think of that as us and them,
right.
You know, us versus the whales or something like that. And he was trying to say what we must become, the phrase he used, we must abandon our position as conquerors of nature and become plain citizens. That was his phrase, plain citizens.
Okay.
And so the idea is a participatory relationship, to work, if you can somehow work towards that, instead of a relationship that's fundamentally exploitative and destructive.
Okay, so now let's talk about symbiosis and what that word means. And I take it that that's going to be a fairly important word when we talk about the environmental ethics and the symbiosis between human beings and the rest of the environment.
Right. Well, as I mentioned, Leopold, at the sort of beginning of his essay, which is quite difficult to read, actually, sort of deceptively simple, but quite difficult, he says, for humans, ethics is necessary to achieve a symbiosis. The reason is that because we are what we are, instinct won't do it for us. Right. Beavers automatically know how to be good beavers.
They can't be anything but.
Yeah. Humans don't automatically know how to be good humans. We have to teach it to ourselves. So that's the function of ethics. Ethics is this system of habits, okay, which we construct, revise according to need, but nevertheless we have to teach ourselves, and this has to become part of our culture. Our ethics is part of our culture, and that modulates our behavior so that we just don't go running around doing whatever we happen to feel like at the moment. We control ourselves, we adopt long-term goals, we're polite to each other, etc., etc., all the things that constitute ethical behavior. But they have to be, it's something we have to develop and then teach ourselves. So for him, so what he was saying therefore is, if you want to have an environmental ethic, which teaches some kind of cooperation and mutual give and take with nature, It has to be based, it's going to be serving this symbiotic need, but we have to have this ethic. That's what I'm trying to say. To have the symbiosis, for us, we have to have an ethic.
Okay.
Right, so he linked it directly to the need for symbiosis.
Okay, so what is the symbiosis?
What is symbiosis?
He was talking about then?
Well, okay, now this, as I mentioned, this is mostly ignored by people who comment on Leopold. They just go right on and start bickering about the details of the land ethic. And there's lots of things you can quibble about what Leopold said. I'm not, but I've been thinking a lot about what does this concept of symbiosis mean. Now, that leads you to go back and look at biology books and things like this and see, does anybody know what they're talking about? And what you find is that amongst biologists and philosophers of biology, there's quite a significant debate about this. The concept of symbiosis itself is not clear. To many people, it's just a sort of a hand-wavy kind of feel-good thing where we should cooperate with nature.
I always think of it as just as two creatures somehow sharing something. Managing to live together. How am I doing on that?
Well, that's certainly the starting point. The first models of symbiosis were in the 19th century when they studied simple organisms such as lichens and various other plant and fungal associations, actually, in which you have plants and fungi very, very closely associated with each other, literally cooperating for their mutual benefit.
Each of the two creatures involved, or whatever the
species,
life forms, right?
Yeah.
Each of them has to contribute something to the relationship in order for it to be a symbiosis. I'm just remembering this from high school.
That's right. And then what you end up with is a kind of an association, call it a group organism, or one gropes for words here, which can do things that the individual organisms couldn't do by themselves. They get a new set of options. Now, sometimes they have to trade something away, too.
Yeah.
Sometimes the partners in a symbiotic relationship lose some of their independence. They have to give up a little bit to join. Sometimes they don't, because there's a huge range of forms and possibilities within nature. As soon as you think of a rule, you think you've come up with a rule that just covers everything, another exception pops up, of course.
Yeah, life is like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so how does this apply in the environmental case? Are we talking about a broader definition of symbiosis? You said that there's some debate among scholars.
Yeah, well, the question really is, I guess, in one sense, can organisms really cooperate, or is it really just kind of a selfish kind of a thing? In other words, is it just, to put it in human terms, enlightened self-interest, or does cooperation, symbiotic mutualism, have a kind of force of its own? And there's a huge spectrum of opinion on this. Now, my own view, although this is still open to debate, is that that it does a chain of force of its own, that the symbiotic associations become what we call in biology units of selection themselves, and their own ends become the ends towards which the system works.
So pairs of life forms, or even maybe groups of life forms, can then be considered as a new single, maybe not a life form, but again, one gropes for words.
It's an entity.
Some new entity.
Yeah. And I mean, the most ambitious symbiotic theory is James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis. Lovelock and also Lynn Margulis, who's a biologist at Boston University, who has applied the notion of symbiosis to cellular evolution. And
that Gaia idea is that the whole world is basically, or should be, considered as a living organism on some level.
As a symbiotic association. Although, again, it's curious that Lovelock himself never uses the word symbiosis. He doesn't think, but is
that part of the debate? Is that part of the uncertainty that
it indicates,
scholars feel about that
suggests to me that it's not taken seriously enough, that people don't think about it enough. And Lovelock himself is talking symbiosis, and yet he doesn't say that. He doesn't seem to. He's describing that, actually, but he doesn't seem to use the word for some reason.
Okay, so how does the symbiotic relationship work then?
How does it work? Well, in detail, we don't know. And so that's one of the reasons why it's maybe not scientifically respectable to some extent. Everybody wants to see an exact mechanism where they say you don't know what you're talking about. What I've been trying to think about is to define it in sort of broad biophysical terms. I'm sort of groping towards a new definition of symbiosis that I'm not aware anybody has really worked on before. And the idea is to sort of think of it in thermodynamic terms. And I don't know how much into this we could totally get, but what you have to look at is, I guess it goes back to something that Erwin Schrödinger talked about many years ago, famous book called What is Life, published about 50 or 60 years ago.
And that's actually kind of interesting in itself, because Schrödinger is known as a physicist.
Right.
And personally, I mean, I'd heard of Schrödinger, but I'd never realized that he'd written a book called What is Life?
Yeah, well, he had a major impact on biology as well. In this book is sort of the precursor of the DNA theory, for example. But what he was concerned with was the simple question that, as a physicist, if you like, how is it physically possible for anything to be alive? Because within physics, we have this thing called the law of entropy, which says that disorder always increases. Physical systems always go to a state of maximum, what they call entropy, maximum disorder.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like my desk after, you know, it's
the more stuff you put on it,
that's right,
the less orderly it's going to be.
Yes, and you can't find anything, and that's the way things always tend to go in nature. Now, how is it that within the confines of the body of a living organism, a relatively constant degree of order can be maintained
for
almost indefinitely? Yeah,
right.
And for example, if you buy the Gaia hypothesis, for billions of years.
Yes, because the world has existed more or less stable, in a more or less stable fashion for that long.
And Lovelock's view is that the world literally is self-maintaining, that the relatively stable conditions of climate and temperature and the salinity and soil pH and a million different things.
They sort of balance each other out in some way.
And they're actively maintained by the organisms in the same sense that my body actively maintains a certain temperature.
Oh, I see. And that's where the danger of thinking of it in conscious terms comes from, because it's easy in our own bodies even to think, oh, I'm, you know, in some subconscious way thinking about my heartbeat or something.
Yeah.
But with the planet as a whole, there's no mind to it that you can say is thinking about it. So it must be purposeful without mind control.
Yeah, but even with my own body, I don't decide to keep my body temperature at 98.6. It's sort of there's a thermostat that keeps it going that way.
Yeah, we don't think of it actively, sure.
Yeah, so Lovelock is postulating a kind of a thermostat, if you like. But in thermodynamic terms, well, let's just forget about Gaia for a second. Just go back to you or me or a tomato plant or something like that. What's it doing? Well, what it's doing in the thermodynamic sense is that life is what they call a dissipative system. It means it has to be a physical system in which there's a generous flow of external energy, food, sunlight. You can't be alive unless you've got this flow of matter and energy which you can use. And then you expend a lot of this energy in maintaining structure. And what they say colloquially is you pump entropy out. So that's what a living system is doing. A living system has to have a boundary, is something Lovelock's correctly emphasized, and it's pumping entropy out all the time. It has to do work to do that. See, to pump entropy out, you have to do something. It's sort of like
active has to happen.
Well, imagine it's like this. There's a big pile of bricks which is always tending to fall down, and you're standing there putting the bricks up again. And of course, you have to expend energy to do that.
Yeah, the bricks in a nice wall would represent an ordered state.
Yeah.
And the bricks all just piled up there as a disordered state, a mess. And in order to keep it as a wall, you have to keep working on it to keep putting them up.
Maybe all the time,
It just keeps falling down. There's no mortar. There's no way to just hold it together and then walk away.
That's right. It's falling down all the time. So as long as you're always putting it up again, and of course that's what your body's always doing. It's always repairing itself, regenerating itself,
and
using metabolic energy to do that.
Yes, that's what I was just going to say. That in our analogy, the person building this wall all the time corresponds to your body taking in energy all the time, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so what this allows, so this is a picture of what happens within an individual organism thermodynamically. What we call active processes are expending free energy externally supplied to maintain ordered structure. That's how you stay alive, okay?
Yeah.
Now, what I'm suggesting is that's how a broader symbiotic association maintains its orderly state as well. You have various organisms within it which have to be doing something. They're expending their own energy to somehow maintain the structure of the thing as a whole. So it's like an organism, only a little more physically diffuse. It's spread out over space and time, but it's still doing the same thing. It's still spending energy to hold structure together. And that's what defines a symbiosis, as opposed to what can loosely be described as a parasitism, a parasitic state, where you have one organism taking.
Yes, and not giving anything back.
So that would be the analogy that I'm just taking bricks off that wall, but I'm not putting anything back.
Yes, and if a parasite someone else has to keep building the wall up, and you're going to keep pulling it down,
Exactly.
otherwise there's not going to be a wall.
Now, the trouble is, let's go back to the environmental issue again. If you look at the relationship of human beings, you and me, well, let's not say you and me, because we're environmentally conscious, but everybody,
That's right.
that was irony for the audience there. But we're human beings in general, you can muster a lot of evidence to support this, are parasitical. We're pulling the wall down. We're not doing a whole lot to put it back up again. And this is going on at an accelerating rate in the world. In the late 20th century, the people who really pay attention to the state of the environment are extremely concerned, because you have things like the ozone hole, building up of greenhouse gases, acid rain, more than anything else, species extinctions. That is the real hallmark, the real telltale sign there's something wrong.
Does a species extinction represent an increase in disorder or an increase in order?
Well,
is the world more orderly with fewer species or more orderly with more species?
I think in a sense it's a representation of breakdown of structure, because what you have is a very complicated, diverse but rather coherent ecosystem. No ecosystem is perfectly coherent. There's always sort of loose ends, but nevertheless it was pretty coherent. And then we're damaging it. So it's like a very complicated computer. And every now and then you're going in and just pulling out a chip or cutting a wire at random. Let's snip that and see what happens, right? That's sort of what we're doing here. And hey, it's still working, no problem.
Because, we're not really thinking of of an end result after we've snipped a lot of these wires or taken a lot of these species away.
Yeah.
Since we're not even really sure in a lot of cases what these species contribute, are we, to the whole system?
Some of them could be of no great significance. Others could be what they call, well, there's a term in ecology called a keystone species. There's some cases where you take one species out, and it turns out that it was providing the sort of stability point for that ecosystem, and then all of a sudden everything goes downhill.
Oh yeah, that would be pretty scary.
Yeah, well, there's many examples of that, and just look around in history. History shows the extent of environmental degradation caused by human beings. There's huge areas of the world that are desert or semi-desert now that were lush, fertile lands 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. I mean, you look at all those cities in various parts of the world that are in deserts, and you say, why did those people build cities in deserts? It seems very strange. Well, they weren't deserts when the cities were built. You know?
What I kind of wonder about in this is that is it just the action of humans, or is there some natural tendency for the Gaia system, for the symbiotic relationship in the whole world, to kind of reform itself in strange ways anyway?
Well, it's always fluctuating around a mean, and there are also external perturbations that can occur, such as changes in the sunlight or change in the Earth's rotation or comet impacts. There's certainly things that can happen, but the evidence that I'm aware of shows that the major problem right now is the human impact. I mean, there can be other problems too. I mean, for example, we've had interesting climate variations in this century, and we don't know for absolute sure whether they are entirely caused by humans or whether they're partially, quote-unquote, natural causes, whatever that means. We don't know for sure. But the overall evidence is that humans are having some kind of extremely drastic impact on the stability of the global ecosystem. And characteristic, to my mind, of a parasitic process.
Yes,
the pulling the bricks down but not putting them up again.
Yeah.
And so what I'm suggesting is you have to start putting some of those bricks back again. We have to do something, and I don't know how we're going to do it. We have to do something to put those bricks back again.
Okay, well, let me, before we get on to that, let me ask you one other thing that comes to mind about the concept of symbiosis as you've given it in kind of a physical thermodynamics term. With Schrodinger's suggestion, you know, about how life has to sustain itself this way, and Leopold's suggestion about a land ethic, on the other hand, how are people going to feel about bringing those two together? What's the reaction of environmentalists and the environmental scientists likely to be to this suggestion?
Well, the reactions are complicated. One of the problems is that when you talk symbiosis, because it lacks a clear definition, it sounds to many people like just sort of a touchy-feely kind of let's cooperate with nature sort of thing. It doesn't seem to mean anything except a sort of a vague plea to be nice or be green.
So is it an important first step to give such a definition?
I think it might be. I think it might be very useful to say, A, what is it, and B, whether or not it's possible. Because to know where you're going, you have to have a sense of possibilities. Now, the thing that sometimes concerns me is that within many the writings and activities of many environmentalists, many very prominent environmentalists, we're always talking about let's do less damage to nature, let's back off, let's stop doing what we're doing. And there's a lot of justice and truth to those recommendations. but one sometimes does not see any aim beyond that. Is there any positive steps we could take? Or,
Right.
or should we just sort of stop being human beings and just go to the moon or something?
Leave the world alone.
Yeah. And
so you're suggesting that while the environmentalists are always advocating doing less harm to the system, they don't in turn have an alternative for how we could do more good to the system.
Sometimes, and some will explicitly say that we shouldn't even try, that's just human arrogance. We're just being, the whole problem is arrogance, and we should, but I think that we're in a situation where, well, let's put it this way, the opposite pole to arrogance is irresponsibility. And the truth has to lie somewhere in the middle.
Yes,
and
some middle ground.
And, you know, I think it's unfortunate that we've done all the damage we've done, but here we are, there's 5.7 billion or so of us, you know, and a limited amount of time. And I think that the issue now is to say, what positive good could we do? Which, in principle, is first to say, okay, some kind of symbiosis may be possible. So we have to direct human activities to rebuilding the environment, not just taking the bricks down. Of course, we have to keep ourselves alive at the same time, which is what makes it so difficult.
And this is where this topic comes in that's been much discussed in the last 8 or 10 years about sustainable development.
That's right, yeah. In 1987, the famous Brundtland Commission, sponsored by the United Nations, issued a call for what they call sustainable development, which has sort of become the buzzword in environmental circles now. It's defined as development that can, economic development, which can meet the needs of the present generation, but without compromising the ability of the future to meet their needs.
So without being so rapacious and parasitic on the future.
Well, one of the problems with the definition of the Brundtland's definition of sustainability is that it's, because it's partially a political statement, it's a little bit vague. There's some serious ambiguities in it. Many people have criticized it on the grounds that it's sort of like saying you want to have your cake and eat it too, so-called oxymoron, you know, contradiction in terms like military intelligence or something.
Right, right. In other words, keep eating the cake and yet leave the cake sitting there.
That's right.
Too,
yeah,
which doesn't make a lot of sense.
It sure doesn't. So, so that's the problem. How do you take care of people? Because we have a billion or more people in the world now who don't even have the basic necessities of life. I mean, we're sitting here complaining because our VCR can't record 3 tapes at once or something like that. And there's people who don't even have clothes on their back, you know. So how do you solve that problem? And yet at the same time start feeding more, starting to put some of those bricks back up again. You want to feed something back into the system. And that's a very difficult problem. Now, I certainly don't have a set of recipes. It seems to me that the direction one would go in the first place is to start to look at land reclamation projects, soil rebuilding, reforestation, things like that. If you look at the amount of time and money and effort that's devoted to things like this now, sure, there's a fair bit of it that goes on, but it's a very minor aspect of human economic activity compared to military activity, for example.
Yes.
Worldwide defense, so-called defense, quote-unquote, expenditures run in the order of $1 trillion a year.
Yes.
Okay, give or take a couple $100 billion. I mean,
whereas projects like land reclamation and so on are still spoken of as oddities and put on the human interest page and so on.
Exactly, and it seems to me that if land reclamation, things like that, were sort of a major focus of economic activity, if we put even half as much into that as we put into highway building, let alone defense expenditures, first of all, you're going to employ lots and lots of people who are sitting around with nothing to do right now, and employ them in possibly very fulfilling ways. Secondly, you're going to start putting some bricks back up again, maybe stabilize some of the climatic breakdown that we're experiencing, maybe save a few species, hold on to some of the loss of biodiversity. Things like this can be done. It just takes a bit of imagination to get it going.
Right, so that your suggestion for a definition of symbiosis is giving us an opportunity to look at it in a new way.
Well, that's what I'm hoping, is the idea that you can say, well, okay, first of all, let's get it clear that it is perhaps in principle physically possible, because what you'll find within many critics, many environmentalists, is a view that it's not even physically possible, it's not even conceivable to think of the human species as contributing positively. We're always going to be a drain on the system, and there are some who've basically said that. We're always going to be a drain, so the only question is to be as little a drain as possible. Now that's pretty hard to sell. You can't, and so you get on, basically you get on the one extreme people like this who say, okay, we're always going to be a drain, and then you get the sort of, you know, the sort of market-oriented types say, hey, it's no problem, the market can solve all problems, all we need is more technology and better striped toothpaste and everything. And there has to be some middle ground on that, you see.
Okay, well, Ken, thanks very much for being on our show and explaining this. I think it is an interesting new way to look at this, and I'm quite enthusiastic about it, actually. My guest has been Kent Peacock from the University of Western Ontario Department of Philosophy. I'm your host, Peter Jedicke from Fanshawe College School of Technology, and you've been watching Search Research. Until the next episode, thanks very much for watching. So long.